4, 3, 2, 1. Testing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Over. This is Stan Tinsley speaking. Today I'm speaking with Mr. Paul Lankford of 705 Hummingbird Lane, Maryville, Tennessee, about his experiences in World War II. Over. I've got it all set on your name, maybe. Mr. Lankford, when did you join the service?
I joined the service on 26th of October, 1939.
And what branch of service were you in?
That was the U.S. Army Air Corps.
Okay. Tell me about your training in the States from the inception until time to go overseas. Training and what you thought of it, people that did it, anything you think might be interesting.
All right. I enlisted, as mentioned there, in October 1939 at Fort McClellan, Alabama. Put on a train from there and sent out to Barksdale Air Force Base at Shreveport, Louisiana. And I had always had my ambition to be a pilot, and I loved aviation. But to my dismay, I mean, it took me about a year before finally that I was sent to Dallas, Texas, to the Dallas Aviation School there. And at that time, the Army had a contract with the civilians out there. They were training pilots. And also, I mean, this was the first school for the aircraft maintenance. So I remained there for 6 months, and we learned everything. And that was back in the day when you had to put everything with, say, hay baling wire and all of this, I mean, that you'd use. And we had to tear the airplane apart, and then, of course, I mean, to reassemble it. So we had a real basic and fine education in aircraft maintenance.
So this was in 39?
This is in 1940.
Okay.
1940.
Okay, go ahead.
And then from there, my unit, I was in the 27th Bomb Group there at Barksdale after I finished my basic training, and also going to Dallas and getting my aircraft maintenance experience. And the 27th Bomb Group then moved over to Savannah, Georgia, and opened up the Savannah Air Base. Today that's known as the Hunter Army Airfield. And we were there at Hunter in Tent City. Had the type of aircraft we had was the B-18s, and then we had A-20s, and then later we had the dive bomber. It was a Navy version, the SDB. And we had the dive bomber. So then we went on to Louisiana maneuvers down to Lake Charles, Louisiana, and then returned back to Savannah. And on the 19th of October, 1941, we packed up everything on the train and headed out to the West Coast. So by troop train, and arrived at out there at San Francisco. Went over to Angel Island, and that's where we got all of our shots. That's where we also, was quarantined.
Excuse me, yes. How old were you then?
I was 20 years of age.
Okay, cool.
Yes. And we then, on the 1st of November, 1941, we boarded the President Coolidge. At that time, this was 1941, on the 1st of November, that was under the Coolidge and many other different large commercial vessels. We still had aboard the band, which was there. We had the civilian cooks, and here we were, a bunch of GIs that loaded on and set sail. So we didn't know where we were going. But to show you, kind of the irony of the whole situation, we had all of our woolen clothing. Here we were out in California, fixing to head out, and we didn't know where. But we set sail and then went into Hawaii. So at Honolulu, we had 1 day liberty, and then we came back at 5 o'clock that afternoon, boarded the boat, the Coolidge, and then set sail. And I guess it was about an hour after that we set sail. Everybody was called up to topside, and at that time they told us that we were heading for the Philippine Islands under blackout conditions because with the Japanese at that time, apparently I guess that they knew that they were on the big Pacific and didn't know where they were. So we were in a convoy, and we had, of course, cruisers and other different destroyers and everything else because there was 3 transport ships that was en route and heading for the Philippines. So about the only thing I guess that happened, I mean, there was watching the flying seahorses and looking out and trying to see and watching the seagulls as they disappeared, and then finally out across, and we ran a zigzag course till we got to the Philippines. Apparently there was I guess they spotted something off over the horizon because the ship that we was on, the President Coolidge, it came to a standstill, and as well as the other transports, and then of course the cruisers and all of these, I mean, they took off and just about went out of sight. And then of course, I mean, they came back, I'd say probably within about an hour. So there must have been something, I mean, that they spotted out on the high seas.
How many days from Honolulu to the Philippines?
We left on the 1st of November, I mentioned there, from San Francisco, and on Thanksgiving Day we pulled into Manila, the Philippines there.
Okay.
Right. So now, if you stop and think about it, that was only 2 weeks before the infamous Pearl Harbor, when we arrived in the Philippines.
Okay. We're complete with winter gear.
Oh, yeah.
That always happens, doesn't it?
Yeah. Let me bring back there at San Francisco at Fort Mason. The barge capsized, and of course a lot of the foot lockers and a lot of the winter clothing and everything else, I mean, went into the bay there at San Francisco. But that was just a little side note, you know, that I thought I'd add to.
Okay. Well, let's see. Hang on just a second. Oops. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Where that let's go into POW camp.
This is Mr. Paul Langford, tape 2. Okay.
So the Battle of Bataan, as far as we were concerned, I mean, came to a close. And the Japanese storm troops were coming south down toward Marvelis, which is on the southern tip of the peninsula of Bataan. And this is where that we had been ordered to. Now, when we arrived down at Marvelis Strip, or airfield there, this was on the next morning. This would be the 10th of April, 1942. The Japanese Zero fighters came in very low, and they were apparently, I guess, some of their pilots still had not received the message, I mean, that we were surrendering. So they came in, they strafed, and we had several people that were hit, and but you had to run for your life there. And then finally, well, that ceased, and then that day we sat under the big banyan trees there and sat around waiting and all of this. And in the meantime, I mean, many other thousands of troops were moving down into Marvelis. And then finally, late that afternoon, we received the order that we were to surrender. And you talk about an experience, I mean, as to something that to see thousands of men, and I'm talking about those, I mean, my fellow comrades, I mean, and to take out a white handkerchief or a shirt tail or anything and put it on a stick because the Japanese said that we were surrendering, and then to march up the hill, back up into the hills there where we were to be bivouacked that night. And you talk about a lump coming in your throat and chills running up your back, and tears in your eyes, I mean, that came because we knew that then, I mean, that we were becoming prisoners of war, and that we were giving up and having to surrender. So that's one of the, I guess, traumatic experiences, I mean, to think of that would never come, but it finally did.
That's it.
And so we went back, and then my first experience to see a Japanese was in a tank. They came down what we call the back road of Marvelis there. They had busted through the lines, came on through, of course, with very little resistance because our own American troops in the Filipinos were retreating. And but this tank commander, of course, I mean, he's speaking in Japanese, and I didn't know, I mean, couldn't understand it, but we heard him bark out some commands, and then, of course, he opened fire with his machine gun, you know, and fortunately, I mean, he didn't hit anyone, but that was our first experience to see those. We spent that night a lot of campfires there and all of this. We did have food because we'd en route we picked up some down by the hospital, and then also there was some food that was provided for us. Well, this was just about like manna from heaven because we'd been on a starvation diet just about it up to this point. So we sat around mostly that night, you know, and talking about what was going to, anticipating, I mean, what would be taking place. Next morning, bright and early, I mean, at practically at dawn, then we were ordered then to go down onto Marvelis airfield. And then this is where that the stormtroopers, the Japanese stormtroopers came in, and they were bitter. And actually, I mean, you take, I guess, if you look at it, I mean, a prisoner of war, and I might kind of draw you an analogy, is that and especially a code which the Japanese live by versus what we as Americans live by is quite different. The Japanese, because the terms which you know of is Bushido and the samurai sword and all this, and to sacrifice your life is for honor and glory, and that's why that they look at it different. But in the American code, then of course, I mean, for Americans, I mean, to have to surrender was not in shame. It was not a dastardly deed or anything else. So you can kind of see that they live by one code, we live by another. So to us, we were nothing because we were yellow. We had thrown in the towel. We were, I mean, people, I mean, who had forsaken our country. So they were also they were warriors in the true sense. I mean, we were now we had been their enemy, and as a result, they had probably seen on the battlefields many of their fellow comrades which had been killed by the Americans. But now they were ready to take revenge. So the treatment, I mean, was very harsh. I mean, I don't guess, I mean, words can describe it. But what they did, they had us to line up, military fashion, and then, of course, I mean, we had to, we were stripped in, I mean, stark naked. The Japanese guards, I mean, came around, and of course, they were armed with their rifles, with their bayonets, and they were taking watch and rings and billfolds or anything like this. People that had on eyeglasses, what they did, I saw it myself. In other words, I mean, many of them, what they do is take the eyeglasses from the Americans, in other words, and then stomp them and break them up. And pity for some of the poor guys, I mean, it couldn't hardly see, I mean, because they had no glasses. Others, I mean, they would take your billfold and, of course, take the American money out of it. Mm-hmm. We had in the Philippines, we had the pesos. They didn't care about the pesos, but they did take that American money. And they would take pictures of your loved ones, sweetheart, or wives, or family, or children, or whoever it was. And then, of course, I mean, they would tear those up right in front of you. And you felt like, I mean, jumping on them, but, I mean, what were you going to do? Because there they were, and you were harmless, unarmed, and they, of course, had the advantage of it. After we stood there, and, of course, the sun came up, and it was hot, broiling sun in the tropics, and stark naked. And then, of course, I mean, then finally, well, we were ordered in, I mean, to put back on our clothes. And then we were told then to head out up Marvelis Mountain. Now, Marvelis Airfield was kind of in a little valley-like, but then start back up the mountain and back up north toward as far as the retreat was concerned. And this is what is known as the infamous Death March of Bataan. And why it was called the infamous Death March of Bataan? Because at the stormtroops of the Japanese were heading south, and then we were heading north. Now, when you say the march itself, was you were herded like cattle. You had Japanese guards in the front of you, on the rear, and on the side, and of course they were armed with bayonets, and you couldn't understand them. We didn't speak their language, and as a result, they'd bark out a command. If you did try to break ranks or stray out, and then of course you'd hear a rifle fire or a bayonet, you'd hear somebody yell out, and you'd look back, you'd see a guy, in other words, he'd been killed. But this, seems like, the screaming and the torture and things like this. I get up to the top of the mountain. Now, when I say a mountain, it was actually, very small mountains in the road that led up through there. But I had planned to take some of the peaches with me, and pretty soon that hot tropical sun beating down upon you, and in the physical condition which I was in, with malarial and dengue fever, and I was beginning to get some diarrhea and things like this because of the food which I'd ate the night before. And so when I got up, I was so that I couldn't even carry just a few cans of peaches. So I finally discarded those, and next thing you know, along the trail there, or the road, this was dropped and that was dropped and everything else, because it was just too much of a burden to try to carry it. And so as I got up to the top of the mountain there, and I decided some shade trees, and I decided I'd just kind of break ranks, and go out there and rest a little bit. But found out that pretty soon, a Japanese guard, he had cornered me, and he had already hit me in the leg with a bayonet. And so then I got back in ranks, and then moved on up. Well, there was a truck up ahead that had stalled. I don't know what the problem was, but the Japanese guards barked out at us and motioned to us, and finally they wanted us to push it. Well, apparently I wasn't too strong and couldn't push my weight, and the next thing I know, I had a jab in the shoulder with a Japanese bayonet. And we moved on up around what was known as the hospital area, and this is where to kind of give you an idea of why I say that we were almost on a starvation diet, was that the Japanese, our Americans, because of the small amount of rations and all of this, and the tropics and so forth that we had, we were sending about 1,000 men per day to the hospitals there. Mm-hmm. We got up to the hospital area, and something that was very unusual, and that was that the Japanese tanks and trucks, heavy trucks and equipment, was coming south, and we were going north. And we were walking on something that felt like a jelly shaking. Well, this was around the hospital area, and we wondered, And then finally, you could smell the stench and so forth and all of this. And what had happened, the Japanese had gone into the hospitals, took all of the different sick and the wounded and all of this of our Americans as well as the Filipinos, put them out on the road and told them to head north. And apparently then, of course, the tanks came along and the trucks, overran them, and there we was walking on human flesh, for miles and miles, because they couldn't make the march. We got on up to around Cab Cabin, and there's a lot of artesian wells. And to show you, what is torture is that marching, in other words, or struggling along and trying to help your buddy and help your friend and things like this. Then with no water, so you ran out of water, and these big artesian wells that was there, they would march you up and set you right down, not in the shade of the tree, but over, right out in the hot boiling sun, and make you move in just as close as they could. And then what they would do is take a few guards and post them around you. And then the other guards would go over and sit on the big shade trees, and they, of course, had water. Anyone that attempted, to break ranks, go over there and to get water, then, of course, they shot them or bayoneted them. So a lot of people on the death march went berserk. They went stark raving mad. They couldn't stand the pressure. And for water, I guess they say that it takes about 3 days going without water. Well, about the most that I went without water was about 2 days. But, your thirst, in other words, gets to the point where you just about come mad. Because, your throat is dry and your mouth is parched and all this. And I had on a pretty good pair of GI shoes, and so this Japanese guard, he decided he wanted to trade shoes with me, and of course he had a pretty large foot. Mine was a little bit smaller, but we traded. I mean, you know, at the point of a bayonet, and so I had to put his on. They were hobnailed and hobnailed shoes, and so it didn't take me very long till I had blisters on my feet, and as a result, those blisters, walking a few more miles, and they would burst, and then next thing you know, I mean, my shoes were completely wet inside. I mean, from all of the excretion from my body, in other words, there. Wouldn't have been so bad, I guess. I mean, as we forced with diarrhea, which later developed into dysentery, and no food, no water. They intentionally, I mean, did this. And then, of course, if you did, as I mentioned, try to break ranks and all of this. Those that was struggling and failed, then, of course, I mean, that was where they met their death, too. Because, I mean, and it was a situation, I guess, I mean, it's almost indescribable. We got up into what's called the no man's land. And this was a couple days later on the march itself. And we were marching day and night. I mean, there was no sleep, in other words. And what we did, it took me about 10 days, I mean, to make the march. But what they would do is to turn you around and then head you back south. Now, we were going north, and then they'd turn around and head you back south. And there was a lot of mass confusion and everything else, well, you know, because, I mean, when you'd get up to a certain point, they'd turn you and send you back. Well, unbeknownst to us, what they were doing was holding us, say, as human gun fodder, because the Japanese was moving heavy artillery into Bataan there, and this was only 5 miles over to Corregidor. So then they could set up their battery of their field artillery and to shell Corregidor over there. So they were holding us down in that particular, the southern part of the Bataan Peninsula there. And then we got into the no man land, and then I had gone just about my limit. No man land might be described, you've seen it probably in movies and all this, I mean, where it's nothing but potholes and filled with blood and guts and dead bodies and stench and horses and things like that, and stripped of all of its foliage and everything else. So we got into there, and I saw a little glimmer. I mean, it was dark. I mean, it was very dark when it was making the march, no moon or shining. And I saw that little glimmer, and I said, that's a water hole. And I said, I'm going to take my chances, because I seemed like, I guess saying that you was dying of thirst. And I said, I'm going to take my chances. So at the dark of the night, then I just kind of slipped out, because the guards couldn't see me, lay down beside the road. And then as the column moved on past, then, of course, I rolled over and moved down and took my canteen, scooped up I guess, I mean, I don't know what it was, dead bodies or whatever it was in this no man's land, and that stench and filth and everything else. And then, of course, I drank some of it, filled up my canteen again, and then moved up beside the road, lay very still, and the next column came on through, and then, of course, I got back into it. But on the death march, I mean, the number of deaths, I mean, still are unaccounted for, actually, as far as the number of people, because there's a lot of them that did escape, and they went into the hills, and the Japanese caught them, and then later brought them into the prisoner of war camps, and then they executed them. But we made it on up to San Fernando, and San Fernando was where that just a big barbed wire entanglement, and by this time, you can imagine now, this was about 8 days, I guess, that I'd been on the road going back and forth. And when we arrived up there, then they gave us a rice ball and gave us some water. And, of course, with the canteen which I had, well, I made it on through. But the stench and the filth and all of this, the human excreta and everything else was all over every place there. And we stayed in this barbed wire entanglement then overnight. Next day, then, at the crack of dawn, they had us up, and under Japanese guard, escorted us over and put us into steel boxcars. Now, in the Philippines, the boxcars are smaller than our American-made boxcars, but these steel boxcars, and they load us into that. When I say load, it's like cattle, and they push you in very close. And actually, I mean, you couldn't get another man, I don't think, in there, in these steel boxcars. Close the doors, and then of course we sat there for about 2 hours. I mean, then the hot boiling head came up, and then began. Well, we went from there up to pretty close to where Clark Air Force Base is, and unloaded there. And when they did open the doors, of course, I mean, the light came in, and it was almost blinding. Bodies began to fall because you'd been pushed in and were standing, I mean, all during this, which took us about 4 hours, I mean, en route by train. I don't know how many it was in the boxcar that I was in, I mean, that had died en route. And you couldn't tell because, I mean, bodies were scattered everywhere. We did have to unload those, and they were dead. Drag the bodies out and stack them beside the railroad tracks. Now, the Filipinos and the little kids, and this is where the little kids wanted to offer the Americans some food. And the Japanese guards then, of course, I mean, as soon as they stepped up and offered some food, and then, of course, I mean, they took the machine gun, I mean, and shot them, see. So women, children, men, or whoever it was, I mean, attempting, I mean, to help the Americans, and then, of course, I mean, they executed them right there by the roadside. Then we made about another 5-mile march, and that was into the first prisoner of war camp, which I was in, and that was Camp O'Donnell. And I'd like to distinguish a little bit between what is a internee and what is a prisoner of war. A prisoner of war is a military person. All right. Now we had Filipinos there at Camp O'Donnell, but that was the soldiers and also the American soldiers that was at Camp O'Donnell. Now an internee is the civilians. That's men, women, children, babies, and all of these that were living in the Philippines, and then of course they were rounded up and then they were put in to prison camps, but they called them internees. And there were children born in the internee camp. But we had, of course, the nurses were separated from us there, and they were put in the internee camps, the women. All right. At Camp O'Donnell, the hellhole, in other words, and that's where thousands and thousands, I mean, died daily. And primarily what we did there on a day-to-day basis was to either dig the graves or to bury the dead. And I think that what brought me through a lot was, of course, the great Almighty above. I put my trust in Him. I had my family, I mean, and many others, I mean, that was interceding and sending the prayers, in other words, to the great Almighty. But I put my trust in Him. And then number two, I think, was the fact that I did not give up. It's kind of like Johnny Majors, you know. He says at the end of the tunnel, you know, there's light to be found, in other words. So I felt, in other words, I mean, not to give up. And I had a good buddy that went through, he and I went to Dallas Aviation School, good Christian boy, one of these Jack Armstrong, all-American type, took his, his exercise and everything else. But after 3 days at Camp O'Donnell, he said, I'm not going to make it through. And he gave up, and he passed on. But I'd go over and see him every day after I come off of the either the grave or digging the graves or carrying the dead to the. What we would do would be hundreds and thousands of people lined up, and they had one little spigot down there, and they would cut the water off. I mean, after say 2 or 3 hours, and so you'd still be lined up, sitting out there in that hot boiling sun with about 10 or 12 canteens. I mean, wanting to fill up your buddies' canteens, and everything else. And then they cut the water off. Well, there was a little creek that ran through there, and it rained a couple of times, and as a result, then the Filipinos, I mean, they were drinking water out of this. Well, with the dysentery, and they were dying like flies. And the same thing, I mean, in our camp there. And it got to the point where that with the potatoes, they gave us a few potatoes. We had rice mostly, and I'm talking about, when I say fish heads, I mean, that was what they were feeding us. Yeah. And then I worked on, there at O'Donnell also, we had an automobile, and they used to call them in the springs. We used to call it a tire tube.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess Mr. Tender remember those. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, the tire
Yeah.
tool. Okay. So what we did, I mean, they gave us some of those, and then we were sitting down and digging holes, and to build a barbed wire fence around the prison camp there. So you'd sit there for hours on end. I mean, trying to dig a hole with that tire tool, and that was one of the tasks. But I mentioned there, from sunup to sundown, mostly was digging the graves. Now, digging the graves wasn't so bad, and when I say graves, I mean not in the description what we had. Actually, what you was doing was digging a big trench, and we would then dig that trench, and then, of course, I mean, they would bring the bodies to go over to what they call the hospital area. When a person, I mean, gets down to the point where they get the death rattle or something like that, or they get so weak, I mean, they can't move, then, of course, they take them over to the hospital area. Not that they received any more better treatment than we did, or any more food than we did. But then they would bring them down and just dump them in to these big trenches, and then go back, pick up others, and then finally, when it was filled up, I mean, was to cover them over. Wasn't so bad, I mean, during the dry season, but then when we was there, and then it began to rain, and the seepage out of it was kind of in a low area, and the seepage from the other graves into the place where you was digging the other trenches down through there, and all of that would come in and fill up, and so at times you were up to your hips, I mean, in all of this seepage out of the other places. Of course, Japanese, I mean, guards, you know, any infraction of the rule or anything, I mean, it didn't seem like, I mean, if they didn't feel right or whatever they wanted to do, in other words, I mean, they were hitting you about the head and beating you up or giving you a prod with a bayonet and things like this. And I was very fortunate, I mean, to leave there and go out on a bridge reconstruction detail. And I might say, I mean, if you're ever in a war, best thing to do, in other words, I mean, is completely demolish your bridges, because we had to rebuild some of those. I mean, that they didn't do too good a job on it. But we went out to a little town that was known as, it was in the Nueva Ecija province, known as Gapan, there in the Philippines. And we lived in a schoolhouse, slept on the floor. I'll never forget the arriving late one evening at the schoolhouse, and of course they had a big barbed wire around it and had the guards and all of this. But we were within about, I'd say, 500 yards of the little city itself, a little town rather. And what our mission was, I mean, as far as Japanese, which was, we were slave labor, was to go out and to rebuild that bridge. And we had to unload from the boxcars the sacks of cement, and then get the stone and things like this, and mix it and the concrete and the mortar, and then rebuild that bridge. Well, we were out there for about 2 months, and then I worked for approximately a month, and I had malarial to the advanced stages, and I had dysentery, and I had pellagra and scurvy, and just about everything, I guess you could say, as far as malnutrition. And so I passed out at the bridge, and they brought me back to the schoolhouse. And the captain that was in charge of our troops there at the schoolhouse, American captain, he asked me after a few days if I would mind staying in the camp there and help him. And I was very glad, I mean, to get that assignment there, rather than to have to go back out in that hot sun and try to do the manual labor there, because I was too weak in the condition. So my job then was to take care of making quinine. And what I would do, I had a big 55-gallon barrel, and I'd get up early in the morning when the cooks would, and I'd fill up the barrel with water. And then me and this Filipino doctor, under the guard of a Japanese, went over to his place and got the chicona bark and roots and brought that back. And of course we made several trips over and then brought this in. Well, that's what the extraction of the quinine is from, see. So I'd throw those roots in there and get that boiling, and boil it all day long, keep the fire going, and boil it down till it was just a thick, creamy, yellow syrup. And then at night, whenever, and also in the morning, I'd stand there, and I had a pot of that, of this thick quinine, and everybody had to take their GI spoon and dip in there, and that was my duty for to see that they took that bitter quinine before they even got fed. See, well, the rations, I mean, out there, I mean, was no better than any other place. I mean, it was a starvation ration. We had rice and fish heads and all of this. It's just about very meager. And finally, well, what we did. Also, I went out and dug some graves for the ones, I mean, that died there. And then I was looking after the sick also that was there at the schoolhouse. And we had to begin to develop what they call beriberi. Now, there's two different types of beriberi. One is the wet beriberi, and that's where the swelling starts in the feet and also in the hands, and then comes on up. And eventually, I mean, it comes up, and your legs, I mean, are as big around as my body. Mm-hmm. And then when it hits the vital organs, all of that liquid that's in your system moves up, and then, of course, I mean, it kills you. And that was the wet beriberi. I had the dry beriberi, and that's where, I mean, it's intense pain in your feet and in your fingers and your arms and legs and all of this. And then it builds up the heat and everything from that, and it's actually the breaking down of the nerves and things like this. And so I had the dry beriberi, and it gets to the point where that you can just barely can walk. I mean, it was the pain was so intense. So I had that, and that developed also. Well, we finished up the bridge and then went back to Cabana to One. And at Cabana to One, I think it's what's possibly most memorable was the fact that anyone that attempted to escape, they divide you up. What they did, the Japanese divided us up into groups of 10. And if one person, escaped, then what they would do is take the other 9, line them up, and then they would execute them before the entire camp. So we had a couple of ours, American boys, that had escaped, and they brought them back in. And of course, they had been beat up. They looked like they'd gone through a sausage mill almost by the time they brought them back in. But then they strapped them down, stripped them of their clothes, strapped them down, and they lay out in that hot boiling sun. And then every day, what we had to do is to walk by and see them. So that first day, they would blister. The second day, the blisters would burst open. And we had in the Philippines we call it the big blue bottle fly. It was about as big as your thumb, a big fly. And then, of course, those were swarming all over them and things like this. No water, no food. And about that third day, then they passed on. But they looked like a charred, just.
One, two, three, four, five. This is Mr. Paul Lankford, tape 3.
So we were explaining the execution of the 9 people who, if one escaped. And so what was so terrible about it was the fact that the execution took place, and we had, later on, I wound up with the Myers brothers, one of them rather, because his brother was in a different group, and he had to witness his own brother being executed there. So they line him up and for the rifle firing squad, and then of course execute the other 9 there. So that kind of put I guess you'd say, a sobering effect on anyone that did attempt to try to escape, because of the brutality which that they would give you the treatment when they did bring you back into camp. And then second, to execute the other 9. we had many of those that I mentioned at the Fall of Bataan there that went to Corregidor, and I would like to mention that Corregidor did not fall on April the 9th. It fell on May the 6th. In other words, almost a month later. Mm-hmm. But it was constantly, it was the big island fortress, and it was constantly being bombarded, I mean, from the Bataan, also with the naval ships which they pulled in there, and then also from the air. So they had, they could hardly even stick their heads out for what, I mean, that there was a shell coming in, I mean, from all directions there. So finally they had to surrender. Now the misconception that's often made is that the death march, that those on Corregidor did make the death march, but the death march, I mean, was those that were on Bataan, and then of course the ones when they surrendered on Corregidor were brought then over to Bataan and sent to the different prisoner of war camps. I wound up then, of course, leaving the Philippines, and they took us down to Manila, to the Port Erie, and loaded us on to the Totor Maru. That happened to be the ship that I was on. And then steaming up through the China Sea and on up into, wound up at Formosa, and at this was a steamer, actually, I mean, a freighter ship that belonged to the Japanese. And we were down in the hole. Now, down in the hole, I mean, is where the scrap iron and where everything else, and down in the, you can say almost the bilge, in other words. I mean, if you've ever been aboard a ship, and we were stacked in there like sardines. I mean, that was just about the description. Then, of course, they would close the hatch up above. Well, the en route then, I mean, to Formosa, we had several barrels. They would close the hatch at night, and then, of course, I mean, in the morning, I mean, they would open it up, and they would let you come out on top side, not on the deck there. And the food was still fish heads and rice, and I began to lose a lot of weight. In fact, I probably down to about 80 pounds, I guess, soaking wet must have been. And a lot of people went berserk, went crazy, dying. I mean, they just apparently, I guess, couldn't stand the pressure and all of this, and then starvation, and then, of course, with the different disease which that they had. We arrived at Formosa, and then they Japanese pulled in, and of course, I guess they were refueling and had us to come off the boat, and then they deloused us. Now, I'm talking about body lice. I mean, that's big as the biggest ants you probably have ever seen, in other words. But I mean, that was what the white body lice, and it was in our clothing and also in that ship, and I mean, that was biting us. And so they deloused us, put us under a big water pressure hose, and then of course we put back on the same clothes. But I mean, the next day we still had body lice. But then we set sail there, and we got to Pusan, Korea. And at Pusan, Korea, this is where they offloaded, and this was 1,500 of our American troops. And they offloaded us, and we had a few British and also a few Australians that was aboard with us. When they offloaded us, well, the American doctors as well as the Japanese doctors examined and you can say culled or whatever you want to. I was among about a group of about 175 that doctors, I mean, determined that we probably wouldn't make the trip from there on up to Mugna, Manchuria. So they put us off, in other words, and we called it the St. Peter's Ward group, you know, because, I mean, they felt that we was going to die, I mean, just in a few days. Well, they took us over then and put us in a big horse stables, and this now was in October of 1942 when we arrived there. The remainder then, of course, went on by train up to Mugna, Manchuria. The remainder of the Americans with the handful of British and the Australians. All right. We stayed there for just about a month. I was getting weaker. I had dysentery to the nth degree. I had the berry. I had just about everything I imagined you could say, scurvy, pellagra, I mean down the line, in other words, as far as malnutrition. And even though it's supposed to have been a hospital, I mean, they still didn't feed us. You would wake up in the morning, I mean, might be a dead one on the right of you, one on the left, one at your head, and then all around, in other words. So it got to the point that in the big open bay where we were in these stables, that we had another little room which was we call St. Peter's ward, and that is where that the person was so weak, I mean, they couldn't even hardly get up. And to show you the American fighting spirit, I mean, I often reflect back on this, is that I happened to be there when one of the fellows was so weak that he couldn't even raise up under his own strength, and he hollered for the corpsman. We had, that's what's called the medics, in other words. We had a couple of our American medics, and they came in, and so they, two Americans had got into an argument. And so they raised him up. Now the corpsman had to raise the guys. They were so weak, and hand him his canteen. And then, I mean, they were going battle royal, I mean, with those canteens at each other. It was, I mean, you know, you think about it. Words, yeah. But so we stayed there for about a month, and then finally there was only about 75 of us. We'd lost, in other words, I mean, about 100 people that had died there within a month. And then so they had cremated the remains, and then we took the boxes and boarded the train, and then we went on up to Mugden, Manchuria. And arriving at Mugden, Manchuria now, that's a big industrial city, and we were living, our POWs were living in an underground camp of an old Chinese camp. And when I say underground, because the temperature the day we got up there, and this was in November 1942, the temperature was about 40 below zero. So you can see, I mean, the change from coming out of the tropics and coming up there. And it was, I think, to my good fortune, because then I began to lose my malarial after getting up there. And we had a kind of a, you can say, a homecoming, because the men from my squadron, when we arrived that night, well, they gave us a good soup and had meat in it. And so after we finished it up, well, they asked me and said, "You know what that was?" And I said, "No." I said, "That was dog meat." Now, what you had to do to catch a dog was, there was dogs running around the camp, and of course we had some sheds out there, and they had knot holes in it. And what you do is dig a little hole out there, and you had to sacrifice your bowl of rice and put it out there, and then you had a little noose, and then of course you get inside, and then if the dogs came out, stuck his head down that hole for it to eat the rice, then I mean, string hole, in other words, and then a couple other guys go out and club him to death. Now you could take the hide and trade that to the Japanese, see, because they wanted it, and then of course we got the meat. But there up at Mugden, Manchuria, we lived in the old camp, and then they built another camp for us, big, about a 12-foot concrete wall around it with towers on it, barbed wire entanglement, and all this, and of course had the Japanese guard. And then most of us worked at tool and die factories. We also worked in out on a farm detail. That was my first job, and I'm talking about taking just an ordinary garden spade. I mean, and spading up, I mean, acres and acres of land. But we did that and planted the vegetables, and then fortunately, I mean, you could occasionally, I mean, during the harvest season, I mean, you know, you could get a carrot or maybe get a little piece of cabbage or something like that. I got, during the winter month, the first winter month that I was up there in Mugden, well, I got caught. You wore what's called a pantaloon, in other words, a heavy quilted material was to wear over there in China against the intense cold and all this. And so I had tied my legs up and had some onions and put in my down my pantaloons there, and so the string broke just about the time we got in front of the guardhouse. And of course they beat me up, threw me in the stockade. Now imagine, I mean, you're a prisoner of war, and then they throw you in a stockade or a prison. But what they do there now with this intense cold, I mean, when it's down about 40 and 50 below zero, they take your clothes away from you and give you one blanket, and then take your shoes away from you, and then they give you bread and water. So they keep you there, I mean, for 4 or 5 days or a week or whatever it is. So, I mean, that kind of gives you a sobering effect, too. But then we went out to sub camps, worked at steel mills, lumber mill where I wound up later on, regular old sawmill, and then a leather tannery and all of this. And it's really amazing that the ingenuity, and you can imagine, 1,500 people and the talents, that they do have, and that they can do. We happen to show you also, the thinking of the Japanese. Now, you had the Japanese guards, and they didn't care what went on. The only thing their primary duty was, to see that nobody escaped. And that you was sent back and forth to work. So, and this the big barbed wire fences were around the different mills where we were. Where are we going to go if he was going to escape? In other words, here you are, way on the interior. In other words, you don't know how to speak the language. You don't know anybody. You don't have a friend or foe, in other words, out there for to help you to assist and everything else. So, attempting to escape, was almost, unheard of, see, when we got up to Manchuria.
No place to go.
No place to go, that's right. And but then the civilian engineers and so forth at this big tool and die factory, what we were doing, we excavated first excavated for a big heavy machinery which was going to be used for tools and dies to cut the bores in a big gun, see. And so what we did, we excavated that, and then of course we began to pour the concrete in. Well, we had the big lathes that was sitting over there. Somebody got the idea, some American got the idea, why don't we pick those up with a crane, move them over here, dump them in, put them in that hole, and because you had about a 20-foot deep hole, which you had to put the base of that gun on, see, that lathe on. And then I spit it up with concrete. So we did. So we buried one of their biggest lathes, in other words, right down there. And the Japanese, the guards standing there and watching, they didn't know what it was all about. They thought that was the way you do it. But the Japanese engineers, boy, they couldn't find that. They couldn't find that big lathe we buried there. Yeah. But we day to day, the activity, of course, the way that the Japanese, and we didn't have newspapers or radio or any outside communication. But the way that we could judge what was taking place was that if the Yanks, talking about the Americans, was hitting the Japanese a hard blow and making advancements, then they in return retaliated on us and they cut the rations. Now, when the Yanks let up on them, then they increased our rations back, and later we did get a little athletic equipment and so forth, and we could use it, see. But that was 7 days a week. As far as from sun up in the morning, till sundown. That's what you do. I think I gained a very valuable lesson about life, about humanity, about people, as my prisoner of war experience. I think, it's, as I often say, I got a triple PhD, in just about anything that you'd want to learn.
Like
yeah. But something else, I wouldn't want to go through that experience again,
Oh, God.
Right.
No.
But learning everything from people talking about music, and then from all of the fine arts, from philosophy, from their thoughts, what, and things like this, and their past experiences and all of this.
When were you all finally, you say the American soldiers relieved you? Finally?
Yes, sir.
When was
All
that?
right. In August of 1945, the Russian Red Army came down from up in Siberia, in other words, and came into Manchuria, and they came down about 1,000 miles with no resistance, and they came into Mugden, Manchuria. So apparently, I guess it was with one of the conferences with President Roosevelt and Stalin and all them, the agreement was made. So they came down and came in there, and we had so when they came into our camp, I'm getting a little bit ahead of my story because they came in the day following when Colonel Donovan Colonel Donovan was chief of the OSS. And in order to prevent what had happened with the German POWs, where that they had executed a lot of them when the war was coming to a close, we had General Skinny Wainwright that had came into our camp and was there. See, we had 22 general officers in our camp up there at Mugden, Manchuria. And General Skinny Wainwright came in there, and then later on, well, they moved him out, and he moved on up to Harbinnen, where he, with his staff, was located up there. But to prevent us from being completely put to death and all of this, they sent in General Donovan with his little Nieces. Now, that's the Japanese out of Hawaii, which in Europe chalked up, I guess, one of the highest awards, that's ever been given, see. But when they came in, they dropped in first. Colonel Donovan dropped into a Chinese camp, see, and thinking that was the Americans, but it wasn't. And so then they captured them, took them downtown, and then the next day brought them out to our camp where we were as American prisoners of war. And so the Russians then, came in the next day, and the Russians expected us to line up the Japanese guard everyone else and execute them. And we had a General Parker, two-star general, Major General, that says no, says America don't do that, says what we'll do is turn them over to the proper authorities and let them take care of them. So they stayed, they would come and visit our camp, the Russians would. Boy, they're fierce warriors, I'll tell you. We're talking about the women, being in the military service. They travel right along with the men. In other words, they carry that BAR, right with them and everything else.
I heard that.
Yes, And so they came in and actually liberated us, but they did. They did commandeer all transportation, and what we did. As far as the changeover, we had the American officers line up, and then we had the Japanese guards and with the commander of the camp to line up, and we had a 46-star flag that one of our POWs had taken and wrapped around his waist and had brought it into the camp, from way back. He got that out of the Philippines. So we sent up Old Glory, and down came the Japanese. And then the Russians, got mad at us because they expected us to line up the Japanese and to execute them right there. That's their style,
Yeah.
But then the Japanese guards and all began to do the menial task around camp. And then the B-29s came in and dropped food to us, and on all of the different dunnage, which that they had, in the airplanes where they had the food, tied onto it. And they came out of, we think, out of North China and also out of Guam and other places like that. And they would write messages on there. Said, of all the missions that we've been on, says, this is our favorite one, and they'd be signed by all the different crew members and everybody else back there, at Guam and all this, to know that the POW buddies was finally getting some food. So we stayed there then for about 2 weeks until finally the Russians gave us some transportation. We loaded on the trains. Now during that 2 weeks, we were going about Manchuria, see, and we could see the Russians. They was, as I say, literally raping the city of Manchuria. They took all the steel and iron and machinery and everything else out of there, and plus, I'd say thousands and thousands or hundreds of thousands of Japanese, and took them back into Siberia. And then we loaded onto the trains, and then went to from there down to Port Arthur, and the Navy picked us up at Port Arthur. Of course, they gave us a shower and gave us, new clothing and all of this, and then we loaded aboard a cruiser, and then we headed out to Formosa. And so en route, we hit a big floating mine, and we limped into Buckner Bay, and at not Formosa, but I think of the name of it. Anyway, I'll come back to that in a minute. But what we did, we limped in, and they sent frogmen out to examine. Now, let's see, I think it was 7 POWs. It was when this mine hit. It killed them plus some of the crew too. And they said it just by a miracle of God. The ship didn't capsize. So we stayed there for a couple of days, and happened to run into one of my cousins. Now, of all the hundreds of thousands of GI troops over there, ran into him, and then we then loaded on the old B-26s, and they flew us from there to the Philippines, and we stayed in the Philippines for about a week and a half. And then they loaded us the Klipfontein, I believe it was a Dutch ship, and we loaded aboard it, and then headed out across the Pacific, supposed to gone into the San Francisco, but there was too many ships in there, and so they diverted us and sent us up to Seattle. And we arrived in Seattle, let's see, I think we liked 3 days being overseas then for 4 years. And we, of course, they put us in Madigan General Hospital and gave us pajamas and all of this and everything, and then, of course, they gave us liberty, and we were there at Seattle and Tacoma for just a couple of days. Then they loaded us aboard loaded us aboard the hospital trains, and so then we came back across, and I wound up at Oliver General Hospital for about a year.
Where is that?
That's over at Augusta, Georgia.
Let's see.
Right, and
Oliver
General Hospital, Augusta, Georgia. It's no longer there. It was apparently a big hotel, from what I'm told. And of course, the military needed it, and we stayed there. And then I was getting 3-day passes and leaves and everything else back and forth.
Was this in 1945?
It's 1945, right.
And you were there for about a year?
About a year, right. And I was going back and forth from my hometown, from Augusta over to Gadsden, Alabama, and then they were, of course, giving us all kind of shots and everything else, and bring us back to our good health. And I decided then that I thought I'd stay with the military, so came back and got discharged, and then went over to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And a bunch of us POWs sitting around there at the NCO club, and so we were talking about what we're going to do, and somebody said, let's re-enlist, and somebody said, you crazy? And said, no. Well, we went up to the recruiting office the next day and walked in, and I think he about fell out of his chair because, everybody else was trying to get their ruptured duct,
Right.
Yeah, get that little ruptured duct to get out of the service. So we... I re-enlisted, and meantime I got married, went down to, met a hometown girl there after I came back, went down to Miami Beach, Florida on our honeymoon, and spent 2 weeks down there. Sam, provided that for all the POWs. And then our first assignment was in New Orleans, Louisiana. And my wife and I went down there. Our first daughter was born there. And then I stayed in with the U.S. Air Force for 30 years, retired, and had some terrific experience, some good ones, very, very good. Had some rough assignments, I was at Barksdale, Shreveport, Louisiana, and then went out to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then from there, Hawaii for 3 years, and then back to New Jersey for a couple of years, Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Went down to Florida, for about a year, and then wound up finally out in San Francisco, California. So those rough duties,
Some of them sound pretty good to me, like Florida.
Very
Hawaii,
good. Yeah, Hawaii, Cape Cod, Massachusetts.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah. Really enjoyed it. And we have, my wife and I, we have 4 children. And we been married now 45 years. It doesn't seem like it. Yeah, 45 years. Yes, sir. Right. Yeah. We have one daughter that lives over in Crossville over here. She's Fairfield Glades, and she's pretty much educated-minded. She's starting a new school over there.
Oh, really?
Yes, sir. Right. And then they run a printing shop, and her husband works for the Crossville Rubber Products. And then I have my oldest son. He is out here at Pellissippi State. He's a professor. And then I have my other 2 children, my other youngest daughter and youngest son, and they're now finishing up their education. So 4 grandchildren.
Well, that's fine. Well, that's quite I'll tell you.